our final example on the panel before we get into the discussion, and I'm sure there'll be many questions, not just from discussants, but from the audience, so I want to leave plenty of time for that. Our final speaker is Katherine Kortum, who's the study director at TRB for the Between Public and Private Mobility Study. Katherine?
Okay. Good morning. I like how everybody's so well trained to respond to that. I do have slides, but I think they've gotten lost in the shuffle, so y'all are just going to have to listen to me instead of looking at the pretty pictures over my shoulder. So I am the study director for a study that TRB did through its Policy Studies Division looking at shared mobility. About 2 years ago, TRB took a look at this shared mobility world and realized that it was something deserving attention, specifically the policy, planning, and regulatory side of things, given that there wasn't a whole lot of data-based analysis going into that. Instead, it was a lot of people waving their hands about and shrieking, and a lot of decisions were being made on who was shrieking the loudest. So TRB did an 18-month study looking at these shared mobility services, and if you've been following any of this shared mobility world, you know that 18 months is an absolute lifetime in the world of Uber, Lyft, bike share, car share, et cetera. Things changed wildly over the course of those 18 months. Nonetheless, we did put out a study in December that looks at a wide variety of different policy issues surrounding these different services. And I will focus here on the things that are most related to access and accessibility issues. There are a lot of equity concerns there. So there's certainly a lot of potential for these services to change the way that people get around, to change their mobility options. The stereotype is that it's all the young millennials who live in the cities and have disposable income who use it to go out drinking at night. And certainly that is a significant proportion of the people who are using these services, but that is not the only service or the only demographic that is using them as well. And when we're talking about shared mobility, a lot of times people think about Uber and Lyft because they are certainly the elephants in the room and they get the lion's share, to say the least, of all the newspaper headlines and all of the attention from the media. They are certainly a very notable part of the shared mobility world, but they're hardly the only part. Taxis, which have been around for a very long time and are significantly less sexy, are also part of the shared mobility world, as is car sharing, as is bike sharing, and the systems that are out there that have a whole slew of names, but we seem to be settling to an extent on microtransit. There are a lot of different varieties of shared mobility that are out there, and it is continuing to evolve at a ridiculously rapid rate. So a service that you think you can define completely right now, 2 weeks from now, we'll probably have some new flavors that you didn't expect, and we'll be partnering with other organizations. It's moving much more quickly than many things in the transportation world have for a very long time. Most of these services, however, are based around smartphone apps. And the growing dependence on smartphone apps for this transit service does mean that there is a bit of a growing divide. To an extent, it is an income divide, but that is much less dramatic than the age divide that exists with smartphones. Smartphones do tend to be fairly prevalent across a wide variety of income spectrums, more than you might think, but it is definitely the age divide that is causing more of the access and accessibility concerns. And when we're considering accessibility issues, there are concerns not just with age or those who are necessarily, not just the health aspect that this particular conference and panel is focused on, but there's a wide variety of different people, different groups of people with disabilities who are both benefiting and suffering a bit from these new apps. One group is the blind. They are, depending on who you talk to, they are both seeing some wonderful, wonderful benefits from this, or it's basically the end of the world. And it's probably somewhere in between those two. But for the benefits, the blind have long had some trouble with taxis. It can be difficult to hail a taxi if you're standing on the sidewalk holding out your hand and you can't really see what's going by. There are also some serious advantages to the digital payment that tends to happen through these smartphone apps. Given that there's no question about what change was received or what money you are handing somebody. There's never any question about the money side of things, which many of the blind have expressed a serious preference for. There have also been some definite concerns, though, specifically with regard to seeing eye dogs or any kind of animal that's helping the person. I hate to say that it's one of my favorite lawsuits because that makes me sound like a terrible person, but it is one of the more entertaining lawsuits I think that is out there. A class action suit from a number of blind individuals against Uber led by one particular person who was blind, and the Uber driver came, picked him up, helped the person into the back seat, put the seeing eye dog in the trunk, and drove off. That didn't go over well, to put it mildly. And it's not the only time that that sort of thing has occurred. There have been a number of times where the dog may not have ended up in the trunk, but where the driver refused the passenger the ride, which did not reflect particularly well on Uber and Lyft. So they are making serious strides to improve their friendliness there. But they are, again, working with a group of not exactly volunteer drivers, but independent contractors over whom they have a limited amount of control. And if the person is afraid of dogs or for whatever reason does not want a dog in their vehicle, Uber and Lyft have a limited amount of control to actually change that with regard to allowing seeing eye dogs in the vehicles. Taxis, to some degree, are much better suited for handling a lot of these health-related trips that need to be made, in part because the smartphone divide is certainly a major issue. There's also the knowledge that some taxi drivers are better equipped to help people who need a little bit of mobility assistance in and out of a vehicle. Certainly not all taxi drivers are going to be wonderful at offering a hand to people getting in and out. But they, for the most part, do have more experience dealing with these populations and are a little more used to helping people who are not 25 in and out of their cars. There's also the question of bank accounts. Not only are smartphones necessary for most of these apps, but most of them also require some sort of a credit card on file. Not everybody has a credit card. In many circles, it kind of seems like everybody has one, and what's the problem? But there's approximately, depending on exactly how you count, 20% of the population in the country that does not have access, that is not fully banked, to use the term, or does not have access to a credit card, and therefore these services are off limits to them. And there's a lot of overlap between these vulnerable populations that really need these services and those who do not have smartphones or who do not have bank accounts. So the taxi industry would very much like you to believe that all of their users look like those in Sex and the City or Gossip Girl or something of the sort, where they're all young and wealthy and totally mobile and just use taxis because that's the easiest and most convenient way to get around. But I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir with this group. We are well aware that taxis serve a much, much larger population than just that. And perhaps the more typical taxi user is actually somebody who uses it more as a lifeline to get from place to place, to and from doctor's appointments or grocery stores or whatever it may be, rather than somebody who uses it because it's really convenient, maybe when they're traveling, which I would imagine is probably the case for most of us in the room. We're lucky enough that it's a very convenient thing, especially when we're in a new city, but it is not necessarily our lifeline, as it is for so many people. So there's a lot of potential, there's a lot of existing cooperation between paratransit and the taxi industry, as, again, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir a bit with this group. I don't always have groups that are quite so knowledgeable about some of these connections. Paratransit, though, is an extraordinarily expensive way to provide transit. As we heard in Atlanta, the average paratransit trip is something on the order of $49, and that is not at all unusual for most major cities. Those of you from transit agencies in the room certainly know that this is not an inexpensive way to get people around, and yet it's necessary, both morally and the federal requirements are such that these paratransit services be provided. Many paratransit agencies have long cooperations with the taxi industry, such that those who, when you think about paratransit, a lot of times the stereotype is people in a wheelchair, which is certainly a subset of the paratransit population, but that is a small subset of it. There are a lot of people who can use regular vehicles, but they just don't have easy access to them, whether it's that the transit routes aren't near enough to them or the stops themselves are not accessible, whatever it may be. But they don't necessarily need a specialized vehicle in order to get access to go from point A to point B. So the paratransit has often partnered with taxi industries, taxi companies locally, to provide rides for these sorts of people. And these new shared mobility services, particularly Uber and Lyft, are very interested in getting a piece of that market. They don't face, for one thing, the same county restrictions that a lot of the taxi industries do and a lot of the services, the transportation services that have come up today. Talk about crossing 5 county lines being a problem. Not at all a problem for these shared mobility services, in part because they pay a little less attention to jurisdictional rules and regulations than perhaps some other transportation services do, but in part because they're just not bound by county lines the same way. There have been many reports of Uber trips that are multi-hours long. Some people take an Uber. It's an extraordinarily expensive way to do it, but going from LA to San Francisco, for example. If you have a lot of disposable income, it's great, I'm sure. So there's fewer hurdles for the paratransit industry to be partnering with these shared mobility services than there is with the taxi industry, given the plethora of restrictions that are on the taxi industry. One of the biggest fails in the shared mobility world in terms of accessibility is a company called Leap, which was based out of San Francisco. And it was short buses, small buses, effectively, that were primarily being used to provide rides for tech workers. So they provided service from generally downtown San Francisco to the Facebook campus, the Google campus, whatever it may be. And they bought a bunch of old paratransit vehicles, and they promptly stripped them of all ADA accessible things because they wanted to make sure that they had room for the drink bar in there, such that they could provide the triple espresso lattes and the $9 coconut waters to their riders as they drove from the Mission District into the Facebook campus or whatever it may be. That company got a lot of negative press for that one, and they did end up going out of business, not because of their $9 coconut waters, but because they ran into major insurance issues. There's a lot of ways, however, that these shared mobility services are definitely improving access that is health-related. Some of it is with regards to, it's not all getting people to their appointments, but Lyft Concierge, for example, is a service through Lyft that is attempting to get rid of the requirement that everybody have a credit card and a smartphone in order to be able to use the service. Instead, you can call into a central dispatch system and they provide the Lyft vehicle. Uber has created its Uber Wave system, WAV, for wheelchair accessible vehicles. You can, in some cities, request specifically a wheelchair accessible vehicle, and also an Uber Assist program where the driver is, at least in theory, trained to help somebody in and out of a vehicle more than just the average person on the street. There are a number of places that are providing reduced cost bike share passes for low-income individuals, people who are on welfare or receiving food stamps or anything of the sort. They're often eligible to receive reduced bike share passes, which in most cities, bike share tends to cost between $75 and $100 a year, so passes can cost as little as $5 a year. The Boston Medical Center has set up a program called Prescribe a Bike, where doctors can prescribe for many of their patients a bike share membership. And then the patients get the bike share membership for free, which reduces their transportation costs, at least in theory, and hopefully, assuming that they actually use it, can provide some serious public health benefits for these low-income individuals or those who are in need of some extra biking for health purposes. The city of Birmingham is one of the first who partner with Blue Cross and provide what they call pedelecs, which are basically electric bicycles. Birmingham is not necessarily the most delightful city to be biking in at all times of year. And so electric bicycles do make it a lot easier to participate in shared mobility all through the summer. And there's certainly, with regard to public health, although not necessarily doctor's appointments, a lot of questions with regard to bike share and helmets. Should helmets be required? What are the benefits required, or the benefits associated with requiring those? Does it deter people from actually using these things? There's a wide variety of policy and planning issues surrounding shared mobility, and I'm happy to answer questions about any of them later on.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all the panelists.